What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 games that I think aged poorly, following up on a video I made a couple of days ago, of course, about the things that I thought aged well, because time is a cruel mistress. Which is actually why I think stuff like this is so interesting to talk about, because ultimately, especially these days, every game is fighting for your time against other games alongside plenty of other things that can occupy your time, and people naturally then seek out what they hope to be the best experiences to spend that time with. And as things advance, especially in the world of video games, older things that at one time were pretty good or particularly interesting for one reason or another suddenly get less appealing overall. But while keeping that in mind, I did want to point out that many of the games I'm about to talk about are games that I enjoy a lot. I would actually still recommend you play most of them, if only to see how things have advanced and, kind of give you a basic understanding of what things used to be like. But mostly when it comes to games aging poorly, I think really a lot of it is just context, especially as new things happen. We suddenly look back and realize the things we used to think were great actually kind of weren't. And while some games and activities in general manage to hold up against that test and retain how fun they are, others not so much. And that is kind of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about today with these games, so let's go ahead and dive fully into it. Kicking it off nice and easy with the original Witcher, known simply as The Witcher, which originally released back in, I believe it was 2008. Now this is an interesting one because, as basically all games that go on to spawn gigantic franchises, it's always fun to see their humble origins, and The Witcher definitely had some humble origins. Built on a modified version of the Aurora engine, emphasis on heavily modded, by the way, the original Witcher had some great general vibes, but everything else looking back was in a pretty rough shape. I mean, everything from like the voice acting, the audio cues, the combat system, the janky animations, the incredibly awkward camera, overall kind of bad pacing. The Witcher 1 is one of those games that I think could desperately use a remake, and, the rumors are that one is being worked on, but we'll see what happens there, I suppose. But this is a game that I enjoyed quite a lot when I was in high school. Despite not having a computer that could really run the thing, well anyway, it was a game that I would say introduced me to the concept of like games being this really mature medium as opposed to something a little more traditional high fantasy, let's say, and for that reason it was always memorable to me, of course. But the things I don't remember caring about back then were like the simple like rhythm game that most of the combat was, the again atrocious pacing of some of this stuff, or even again just how bad some of the voice acting and like the audio cues of that voice acting were. It's a game that, especially if you play it in today's day and age, you can feel that it's very sort of amateurish, which probably isn't a surprise given that it's the first game. But ultimately, if you look back at it, The Witcher 1 is just not a game that is terribly fun to play outside of course, just experiencing it in the context of the other Witcher games. And it's definitely fun to see how much they improved and stuff from this point, but it was a rough start out of the gate. Which brings us to our second entry, which is bound to be a little controversial, but is certainly a game I've talked about plenty in this context, which is actually Planescape Torment. So let's get the obvious stuff out of the way before everybody hounds me in the comments about it. Planescape Torment has an incredible story. It is really well done. It touches on a ton of topics about redemption, suffering, hope, all this other stuff that is, again, just incredibly well done. It is a fantastic story that I absolutely think people should experience. But as I always like to tell people when Planescape Torment comes up, it's not a very fun game to play these days. In terms of gameplay, I would actually say it is one of the worst as far as the Infinity engine goes. And much of the reason for that, at least for me, are the changes that they made to the system trying to accommodate the primarily narrative game that this game really wanted to be. So whereas other Infinity engine games actually make use properly of the AD&D rule set and, it's easier to follow, Planescape Torment, unfortunately, has a fair bit of combat in a game that is clearly more about the story, and ideally you're going to build your character to get the most out of that story. And that stuff, on top of the kind of just weird stuff they did with like the classes and stuff here, really makes for what feels like a bit of a jumbled mess in terms of the gameplay side of that incredible story. It also doesn't help that it is a very, very front-loaded game. The back half is pretty notoriously light on content, as they were naturally running out of time and money, which can lead to all sorts of pacing problems, quests that are essentially just go here, talk to someone, come back, quest done type of stuff. And so putting all that together, as much as I love CRPGs and that kind of being my whole thing, outside of the story, I actually don't think Planescape Torment is very good generally in terms of, it as a game. And that has become all the more apparent as the years have gone by and it becomes increasingly arcane to get into it to begin with. And so ultimately, I think people should try to play Planescape Torment, see if it's their thing, provided, it comes up in a way that is convenient for them, let's say. I think the story is worth it even then in trying to experience, but basically everything else surrounding it just feels really bad. Speaking of games that feel pretty bad, though, let's talk next about Fable 3. Fable 3 is an odd duck of a game because on one hand, I applaud a lot of the stuff it tried to do in terms of novel ideas with how it tries to put all of the menus in game as things you interact with, but that actually winds up being a little bit annoying because, when I hit escape or whatever, I don't necessarily want to be teleported to a room to interact with things that function as the menu. I kind of just want you to bring up the menu. But even outside of that stuff, it also does other interesting things, like letting you become a ruler and make all of these decisions. But unfortunately, those decisions can all be undercut by just gathering enough gold with what is the real game, that is to say, the real estate market. And while generally for this video, I want to stray away from things like technical problems, because obviously as things age, they're going to become less and less compatible with modern hardware. But for Fable 3, I do think it's worth a mention specifically that that's more of a problem here than you might think generally, because the PC versions in particular came with Games for Windows Live, which is no longer a thing that really works properly. And so to even get it running over there, you have to jump through a million different hoops, which means this game is, on top of being very dated in a lot of ways, also just straight up not available potentially, even in a place you bought it. But even once you get it running, a lot of the movement feels really strange. It's also impossible to technically die. You just lose experience when you go down to 0 health this time around. And basically all of that together, it's the type of game you look back at and realize that it kind of was just held together with duct tape. And while it certainly has a couple of moments here and there, by and large, so much of what this game was trying to do, I think, just doesn't work out on a fundamental level, even if it was fun enough at the time for what it is. And what it is these days, to me at least, is a game with some novel ideas that ultimately just didn't work out, leading to a game that aged pretty horribly. But that does bring us to our fourth title, and this one is actually a personal favorite of mine that I threw on here just for that reason, and it is actually the original version of Oblivion. Obviously this year brought us Oblivion Remastered, and if anything, I think that remastered version highlights just how outdated the original had become. With that in mind, if you watch the channel much, you probably know how much Oblivion means to me personally, and it is a game that I have always loved in spite of its flaws, but I will also always be the first person to tell you about those flaws. The easiest by far for the original Oblivion was simply the fact that the leveling system was just fundamentally broken. And while it worked fine enough for the type of people who play for a little while, never finish the game, and move on, reality is if you played a character much past level 20, or if you built them wrong from the outset, which is very easy to do as some of the presets were just going to run into that problem, you would very quickly find yourself with mounting opposition that is actually outpacing you pretty quickly, with health that scales endlessly based on your level, meaning that it's possible to wind up with a very weak character that just can't deal with those enemies, and that was by far the game's biggest issue. Obviously, there are other parts of it that didn't age super well either, like the weird, persuasion minigame, the potato faces, some of the weird, Radiant AI stuff they did, but that's kind of the interesting thing about Oblivion. At the time it was released, so much of that stuff was, really big and novel, especially the Radiant AI, because that was, the first time that had really been a big thing. And it was really cool to see how it interacted. And yet, by today's standards, it's also incredibly rudimentary, to the point where it's almost comical how just silly it is at times. And a significant amount of Oblivion Remastered was, kind of touching all of that stuff up and making it more accessible, let's say. Also fixing the leveling system. But There's a common enough sort of description of the original Oblivion that I think fits here, which is that it's kind of like a stained glass window. It's made up of a bunch of broken parts that come together to form something kind of beautiful. You know, depending on the eye of the beholder and all of that. But Oblivion is, I think, one of the Elder Scrolls games that aged really, really badly because of all the stuff it was trying to do. In fact, some people like to bring up Morrowind in this conversation, but I would actually say that outside of the combat, Morrowind did age better than this. So ultimately, I love Oblivion, but I think it aged pretty badly. Though to be fair, maybe it could say the same thing about me. That, however, brings us to our final entry, and it is going to perhaps be the most controversial, and that is actually none other than BioShock Infinite. BioShock Infinite is an interesting one because it is a game that a lot of people love and a game that I actually do think is worth playing. I think you should play this game for yourself for sure. And to that end, for this one, I'm actually going to start off with the things I like about it. Namely, the city of Columbia, the different visuals coming from the original game. It creates just a very sort of unique and open feeling aesthetic, even if it's not actually open. I also think they did some really incredible stuff with Elizabeth as like a follower, as the game is in many parts what feels like a long sort of escort mission. They managed to make that feel impactful and like she was like a real character following you around, and there was just a ton of like little moments in how you interact with her that makes it just kind of feel a bit more alive than it certainly could have. And those are the things that I think Infinite does really, really well. However, past that stuff, I think, especially looking back at it, there's a lot of stuff that I just don't feel stood the test of time. Namely, in that Infinite was a very big departure from the first two BioShock games, in the sense that it kind of dropped a lot of these sort of immersive sim elements for what was effectively a more on-the-rails shooter. Sometimes literally with you grappling onto the sky rails. And while I would say the moment-to-moment gameplay, or the gunplay perhaps might be the way to put it, is still probably better than the original two, just in terms of how it feels to actually play, especially once you get used to all the mechanics and stuff. Once you scrape past that sort of initial layer of paint, you start seeing the parts underneath that don't feel so great. Like whatever this upgrade system was like the clothing, where you don't have like options, but rather picking up clothing after you're already wearing some just overrides what you have. That feels pretty bad. Going from having all the guns to just being able to have two at once kind of sucks. The powers feel kind of standardized and worse. The game tries to give you this illusion of being open, but it's actually pretty closed, with the sky rails mostly just ferrying you from one specific location to another, and you can't really go back or explore what feels like this beautiful city that they've made. And that's before you even start looking into the parts of the story that it just doesn't feel like they did a lot with. And yes, there's the part of it that starts introducing like time mechanics and stuff, and that's always going to get a little messy with basically any game. And it certainly does here, though to their credit, I actually do think there's a lot of little stuff that clears up a lot of the common complaints people have with the time stuff. But that's still just a whole can of worms every time it gets opened, you know? But ultimately, if you look at BioShock Infinite from today's standpoint and actually, play through it even, it's mostly just an okay shooter that feels pretty good as long as you don't start, poking at the seams and asking questions, because the whole thing starts to fall apart as soon as you do. Which is, of course, what it's doing on this list. But you can obviously tell me how you feel all about that down in the comment section below, because we are wrapping this up, and you may as well like, comment, and subscribe while you're here. I'd love to hear more about games you felt aged poorly or well, I suppose, as there is certainly obviously going to be a fair bit of subjectivity in a subject like this, which is kind of why I wanted to make the video, to be honest. But just because a game didn't age particularly well certainly doesn't mean it's bad. And if anything, I think it makes them all the more interesting to check out as a bit of a historical piece of video game history, if anything. But either way, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.